Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
This week we're talking about the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and I know many of you listening will have a view on the future of the BBC and also whether or not it should survive, could survive, and if it does, how it could or should be funded. A couple of guests in our Taxpayers Alliance studio this week. By the way, I'm your host, Duncan Barkes. We have Darwin Friend, who's Head of Research at the TPA. Hello, Darwin.
Hello, Duncan.
Good to see you. And let's welcome Rebecca Ryan from Defund The BBC. Hello.
Hello.
It's really decent of you to come in. Thank you. Just a little note here. If you hear anything on this podcast and you want to comment on the conversation we're about to have about the BBC, you can email podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. There's a load of stuff to talk about regarding the BBC. Rebecca, we're going to get your thoughts on your campaign and why you set it up in a second, but a little bit of housekeeping here regarding the Taxpayers Alliance before we really crack on with the meat, if you like, of this week's episode. Darwin, just tell us about the great work the TPA has been doing about inheritance tax.
Yeah, so this week we've launched our polling, which showed that inheritance tax is actually the most unpopular tax when people are asked in the entire country. We asked them on a range of taxes. You had income tax, VAT, stamp duty, and every single group decided to say that actually inheritance tax was the most unfair tax. In fact, there was only one demographic, I think, actually, which said it wasn't, which was PhD students,
right?
Who decided of every tax that they thought insurance premium tax was the most unfair, which I can understand their reasoning. But when you think about every single group, whether it be social class, gender, age, voting history, the fact that every single group other than PhD students thought that inheritance tax was the most unfair, I think that really does show that our campaign pushing for inheritance tax to actually be abolished in its entirety is fully justified.
Rebecca, you were laughing at this. So I'm going to spring this on you before we get down to the BBC chat. Inheritance tax, do you have a view?
Well, it just reminded me, actually, I've got a 16-year-old daughter who's a little bit of a lefty at the moment, as you would be at that age, and she sort of said to me, she completely agrees with inheritance tax. I said, well, you won't want an inheritance, then I'll just blow all the money, that's no problem. But I remember, actually, I don't think I said, but my sister, when we're close in age, when we were of a similar age to my daughter, she was saying the same thing, and my dad had the same conversation with us about that. So I think it is. I was just surprised that maybe you didn't ask anyone of the age of 16, but it's I think it's an awful tax, and it should be got rid of.
Well, with all these taxes, I mean, in my experience as someone who's a father to a daughter who's just left her teens, they're all for it because they get hit over the head with this kind of like, we must redistribute the wealth in this country until they have to start paying it, and then they have a different view.
Yeah, quite. And I think what's really brought this to light as well is what the government did in the budget last year, where they have decided to reduce the relief that farmers and family businesses can receive when they pass on assets to their children. And that was kind of what partially launched this campaign. But I think actually what it highlighted was how unfair this actually is. The outrage people thought of family farms and family businesses all of a sudden not being able to be passed on to the next generation seemed totally unfair to them. And actually, I think what it highlights is that it's not just those reliefs being reduced which is unfair, it's the entire system of inheritance tax which is unfair. And I mean, I quite agree with what you've both said. I think young people, when they think about inheritance tax, they think, I'm not going to have to pay it. So yeah, it's quite right that wealth should be redistributed to the general population. But the issue is that inheritance tax has gone from being a tax which the wealthy pay to actually a tax which most people are going to probably end up paying, because the thresholds are now at the stage whereby people's houses are being pushed into this. And so I think people are rightly furious about it.
Another good bit of polling by the Taxpayers Alliance. If you're listening to this and you want to find out more about the results and read more about it, go and check out the Taxpayers Alliance website. Should we talk about the BBC? That's why you're here.
Right, let's do it.
So, a little bit of disclosure. Two things here. First off, the TPA, Taxpayers Alliance, launching a monthly blog, if you like, called BBC Watch, that I'm writing, which is almost a little bit perverse because I worked for the BBC from 2015 to 2021. And I say in the piece that I wrote, it's kind of like, what am I? gamekeeper turned poacher in some ways. And I have a view on the BBC, and we'll touch on this a little bit later on. I think as a starting point, though, when we talk about the corporation and we look to the next couple of years, because there's a charter review in 2027, we know that there's chat in political circles about what the BBC should look like and how we fund it in the future. Let's talk about the funding side of stuff. And let's kick off by talking to Rebecca about Defund the BBC. Just a bit of background about your campaign. Why did you start it?
Actually, it was a young guy called James Usell who started the actual sort of Twitter handle in the summer of 2020 on the back of the Black Lives Matters, what was called largely friendly or peaceful protest, which we could all see with our own eyes was not a largely peaceful protest. And so people were outraged, and therefore the sort of defund the police turned into defund the BBC. And the hashtag itself sort of got 100,000 followers sort of overnight. It was very, very quick. Now, I knew James from before. He used to write some stuff when I was working doing the Free Market Conservatives blog site. So I sort of stepped in to help him, and then he went on to sort of... I think he went on to get a sort of proper job and what have you, and didn't have the time. So I took over from there. But yeah, it was on the back of that, and I think people were just sort of outraged to see clearly the BBC sort of gaslighting the nation over what was really happening. And it was that sort of two-tier policing and two-tier reporting, and they were sort of just outraged. But I think it was on top as well. I mean, I've done a lot of campaigning around Brexit as well, and so for me personally, my sort of wake-up call for around the BBC was their reporting of Brexit. You know, the morning after the vote, they were behaving as if there had been an absolute sort of abomination, and that the country was full of these rabid racists.
Look, I can go one better. I was in New Broadcasting House when the Brexit result came through in 2016. I was doing the coverage for BBC Radio London as a presenter. I was anchoring it. And there were people who were genuinely dumbfounded by the result. And I like to think when I was at the BBC, I played everything with a straight bat because there's an element of journalistic integrity. So I never revealed on air my political allegiances or beliefs. But now I'm not part of it. It's pretty obvious. But they were dumbfounded by the result. And what was interesting about it, and I remember saying this to friends of mine, if you were outside of London and, like me, had spent time working in Liverpool or in places like Durham in the northeast or whatever, you could see Brexit coming down the tracks a mile off. Yet these people in this bubble, in New Broadcasting House or possibly inside the M25 or whatever, they just had no understanding this was going to happen.
Exactly. And so that for me, like I say, was the wake-up call of seeing that and thinking, this isn't right, actually. Because, I mean, I voted for Brexit, but when I was thinking about voting, I'd worked for a couple of European-based companies. For me, it was about sort of, we're not the same in how we market things and how we manufacture things, and this kind of pushing together of these countries in a kind of like unseemly way, the destroying all of that culture. For me, was the main reason that I voted for it, and also it was an economic basket case. But then to be turned around and sort of be told you're a racist because this is your motivation, and also,
or even worse, sorry to interrupt you didn't understand what you were voting for, which is the most patronising load of guff ever.
Exactly, absolutely. And as you say, you know, I used to live in London. I know the London mindset, that dinner party mindset of what's the cool thing to say, what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. And when you move outside of the M25 and you meet people, it's so refreshing, and they aren't, a bunch of rabid racists, and it was just outrageous. So that's for me why I got involved in campaigning around that.
Okay, and we're going to touch on the Taxpayers Alliance research and the paper you wrote, Darwin, about the future of the BBC and funding in a second. But let's just explore in a bit more detail. Defund the BBC. What is your main objective right now?
Our main objective is to, so for the last 4.5 years, what we've been trying to do when we had the Conservative government was to get them to see the light, to get them to decriminalise the licence fee for a start, because there's 130 prosecutions a day. It's an absolute outrage. It's clogging up the courts, and also 74% of those who are prosecuted are women, and that is actually a social justice issue. And I know that that's sort of not the coolest thing to say in this kind of on the centre right, but it is, because the reason it's 74% are women. It's not because that women are more likely to commit crime. It's because they're the ones who are at home raising young kids. They're the ones who are more likely to work part-time, be carers for the elderly, and it's whoever opens the door gets prosecuted because the licence is attached to the house. So I think it's, that was our initial thing, was to try and get it decriminalised, because that's, awful. But then also now for us, now that we've got a Labour government, it's highly unlikely that they're going to get rid of the BBC licence, although there's been some murmurings.
Yeah.
It's to raise awareness about what people can and can't watch without paying for the BBC. You don't have to have a TV licence, but a lot of people are really scared by these letters.
Yeah.
The BBC spends sort of £6 million a year threatening the public, and they don't make it clear what can and can't be watched. They don't sort of say you can watch all of Netflix, you can watch all of ITV Hub, as long as it's not being live broadcast. And it's that thing that confuses people. They think, I don't know what a live broadcast is. It's not live sport, it's actually broadcast to a time, to a schedule. If you are clicking on demand for that particular time, then you don't have to, as long as it's not iPlayer, you don't have to have a TV licence. And that's the really frustrating thing, is that people aren't fully aware of that.
Yeah, no, that was actually going to be what I was going to ask you, Rebecca, was about what are the mechanisms that people can use to not actually be hammered by the BBC for not paying the licence fee. So some of the examples you say, I think a lot of people may have heard, for example, about Netflix and Amazon Prime or Disney Plus. If you watch those, you're fine. But so is it the case that, for example, say if you wanted to watch ITV, you can't watch ITV live then without paying the licence fee?
You can't watch any live broadcast, no matter where in the world it's broadcast, if it is a TV broadcast. So you can watch a live stream, but you can't, as long as it's not being simultaneously broadcast. So if it's, say, for example, Sky News on YouTube, that is technically a live stream, but it's being simultaneously broadcast, at the same time as a TV channel is doing it. And they've closed that loophole. Originally it wasn't. So anything else that's not a live broadcast TV channel, you can watch. When it gets complicated is things like Amazon Prime. They do have some live channels. They have some live sports channels within it. ITV Hub, for example, you can watch all their on-demand content, but none of them you can click to see the live channel. Right. So the thing is, it's impossible for the BBC to police when they send people out if you know what you are and aren't allowed to. And that's the thing, because they can easily trip you up if you're not 100% on knowing what it is that you're sure that you're not watching.
So you want greater clarity on what people can and can't do. Okay. Defund the BBC, does that go so far as to say, where do you stand? Do you think the BBC still has a future in this country?
I think, the BBC is very confident that it's extremely popular, and I think that if it went over to a subscription model, for example, then, if it is as popular as it says, then people, there would be some people that still sign up to it. It would probably have to trim down a huge amount. At the moment, it's hugely wasteful in its budgeting.
Yes.
But it could, it could. The thing is, as I've said, we have subscriptions to Netflix, to Disney Plus. It's in our culture now to have these different subscriptions, and I can see that the BBC could fit into that if it makes programmes that people want to watch.
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? Because generations coming through will not wear the concept of a licence fee, because you mentioned your daughter, and I've got a daughter as well. They're used to making the choice. I'm going to pay this every month for Netflix or this for Spotify Premium. So the mindset is changing. You're not going to have people who will put up with this. Darwin, this nicely gets us into your paper and the research that the Taxpayers Alliance has done regarding the possible future of the BBC in terms of funding. Yeah,
just picking up on what you just said there as well, I think people won't wear it as well because it's practically unfair, realistically. I think everyone understood when this thing, back in the 1940s, so obviously a long way before today's younger generations were around, but everyone understood at the time, there's one channel, you've got to pay in return for receiving its content. That's perfectly fine, but it's now been a very long time since it's just been the BBC in town, and an even longer time since we've had a vast plurality of media that people can consume. So that was really the reason why we did
let me interrupt you. I know I'm doing a lot of it, but you make a cracking point, because the licence fee was brought into being in 1946, right? Since then, we've had the massive explosion of commercial broadcasting, both TV and radio, and this small little invention called the internet as well, which surely must make them, at Broadcasting House and elsewhere, think, hang on a second, we can't continue to use this funding method.
Yeah, when you look at the amount of people that are paying the licence fee, it's dropping every year now, and you can see why. People are more interested in going onto those online subscriptions rather than feeling, hey, even if you don't want to watch any of the BBC, as we were discussing earlier, listener, you've got to pay for it.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't seem fair. And I'm sure there are certain programs such as the Traitors or other things like that, or Strictly, commercial programs like that people do find very popular. But I think £169.50 a year in return for that I think most people think, actually, no, I'd rather not have any of that, and I'll just go online instead.
Rebecca mentioned subscription as an option. Where does the TPA sit in all of this?
Yeah, so we did a big paper 2 or 3 years ago now, which I wrote on kind of funding options for the BBC, and subscription was one of them. It's often touted because I think it's probably the simplest one to go to. I mean, everyone understands the subscription model now because they do have Netflix or Amazon Prime or Disney Plus, and I think that is one option. The paper that we ended up doing kind of didn't recommend that going forward, largely because there is a lot of public consensus, I still think, out there for this concept of public service broadcasting and the BBC's role within that. And I do think a lot of people, when they think of the BBC, do think the bread and butter issues they should be doing, which is local radio, news, cultural programming, effectively that sort of programming which isn't particularly commercial, like you can't make money from that. And then what we decided is, rather than forcing people, if they want to watch that content, to pay for it through a licence fee, or rather than having some tax which is currently being touted by the government, which everyone has to pay in order to fund the BBC, what we recommended is doing what the Australians actually have, and what a lot of countries have, where they have a public service broadcaster, which is have some government grant, effectively, which is given on to that broadcaster to produce that form of broadcasting. But then the more commercial aspects, Traitors, Strictly, things which could, BBC One, radio, BBC Two, on the radio as well, those things could be sold off, or there could be a subscription, or whatever the BBC wanted to do with those, they could then do, but it would receive a government grant for those things which aren't strictly commercial in their basis.
A lot of chunky stuff there, Rebecca. Anything there that you think, yeah, that could work?
I mean, I think the main issue with the BBC is that it has this sort of safe funding stream that means that it is not accountable to the people that are having to pay for it. If you had a grant that was kind of had to be competitively pitched for by other broadcasters, that meant that the BBC had to slim down, had to be responsible, had to actually there was a level playing field with other broadcasters that meant that they were accountable, then I'm sure that would be more appealing to people, certainly, and that the huge cost of the big, like you said, the big series, Strictly and what have you, that could be under a subscription model. I think the British public would probably be quite, even though they, 2/3 of the public vote against, vote to get rid of the licence fee time after time after time. So it's not a popular mechanism. But I think also for the BBC to be doing advertising, I think people would just be like, we can't get down with that somehow.
Go on.
So, what I was going to say is, I think perhaps then we need a wider conversation about public service broadcasting, because that then changes this entire topic. Because even though we always think public service broadcaster, okay, that's BBC and maybe Channel 4 as well, but actually all the main broadcasters have public service broadcasting obligations placed upon them, and so maybe there needs to be a conversation, a wider conversation, actually, about is that still fit for purpose or not?
Absolutely.
Adverts on the BBC is really interesting. So my background, aside from doing a 6-year stint at the BBC, has always been commercial broadcasting before I dabbled on the darker side. And I will tell you that commercial radio groups in particular would hate the idea of adverts on Radio 4, because of course it means there's less pie available for them commercially. So you would find, and I'm not suggesting that you're advocating this, but you do hear people just say, oh, well, why can't the BBC have advertising? Well, because that would damage the commercial sector, because there's only a certain amount of advertising to go around. So you would find radio groups like Global, who run LBC, just going, hang on a second, you can't have adverts on 5 Live or Radio 4, because that's going to really affect our business model. Let's talk about the public service broadcasting side of things. Do we think it's important in the modern age, Rebecca?
I think at the moment, potentially still, just because there's an older generation that still consume content and news in that way. But I think the young people, they are, the whole model, if you're going to still somehow have some sort of public service broadcasting, I don't know how we would reach them, but it would have to be online. It's got to somehow come into this sort of on-demand area, and that certainly needs a complete rethink. But I think we're just in those times of transition where there are an older generation that still listen to local radio, but I imagine those listener figures are coming down and down.
Well, they are, and again, as someone who's been there and done that, I feel quite passionate about this, because commercial radio doesn't do local radio like it used to, for very understandable reasons. They can't make money out of it anymore, so why should they? They're not a charity, right? So you then look at the BBC, and one of the things the BBC has done over the last last 5 years is decimate BBC local radio stations. So they've reduced the staffing levels, which in some cases were a little bit on the heavier side, but they've reduced the service. And I think, Rebecca, you've hit the nail on the head. Those loyal licence fee payers tend to be older people, right? An older generation. And I was giving an example earlier before we turned the microphones on, which is, you've got, and this is going to sound a little bit stereotypical, but let's say you've got Doris who lives in Blackburn, who's always listened to BBC Radio Lancashire because she likes the local chat and stuff. Now, there's still an element of that there, but if you tune in the evening, you're going to get some really peculiar programming that's not aimed at Doris. In fact, no one seems to know who it's actually aimed at, but Doris won't like it. Yet Doris is the person who's paying for it. And I do think while we have those older generations still with us who are loyal to the BBC, rightly or wrongly, but 9 times out of 10 they've grown up with the BBC, they should get some service for the money they're spending. But I think you're right, Rebecca, as generations come through, that need for local radio to be a companion and a friend will disappear. Where do you stand on public service broadcasting in terms of the way forward?
Yeah, I think it needs to be loosened a little bit, because actually when we've seen in previous cases of privatisation, for example, for Channel 5, when it was bought, I think back in 2011, if my memory serves correctly, the amount of public service broadcasting obligations on it were increased. But actually what Channel 5 then decided to do was actually go above and beyond that. So I think what we actually need to think about is, rather than designating to every single broadcaster, you need to produce X amount of hours of news content, X amount of hours on on educational content, and so on like that. I think fundamentally, there does need to be some level of that, but I think there always will be, because there's always going to be some interest in market for that. But at the same time, I think we need to give a bit more freedom to broadcasters for them to choose the content that they want to produce.
Where do you stand on the World Service?
I think that needs to probably, under the kind of system that I defined, I think that probably does need to stay within some form of government grant system if the government were to go that way, largely because I think it is a great soft power tool for the UK across the world. I think lots of people in the US and in countries far afield, which probably don't have as good a plurality in their media market, look to the BBC and think, wow, that is a really good ambassador for brand Britain.
We're in a similar place. That's what I've written about partly in the BBC Watch blog that we're launching. I think the World Service used to be funded by the government. I think it was George Osborne who just went, hang on a second, we can save a few quid here, when he was Chancellor in 2011, and made it being funded by the licence fee. I think it's a good soft power tool, and we've seen inside the last 2 years with everything from Ukraine to the Middle East how quickly the world can change. Is the World Service still relevant, do you think, Rebecca?
I think what I always find amusing about the World Service is that, the BBC is kind of this, so going back to the Brexit argument as well, with sort of how they see this sort of the anti-empire. Well, I see the World Service is kind of pretty much, that kind of soft power thing. Yeah. You're going out, you're telling the world what they should think, and they are putting a bias on it. We get complaints, and we have supporters who are from, Kashmir or, from in Israel, who are really, really, really against the BBC. So they're doing their kind of manipulating the agenda and manipulating the news cycle around the world. And I always find it sort of quite ironic that it's the BBC's going out there. It is like, they're sort of taking the British message. We know better. We're telling you how to do things. So I don't know if there is a place for it. I don't think that the sort of soft power, is that a good thing? Are other countries doing it? Do we need to try and influence people in that way? But I know it's something that's quite popular, I think, with the British public. So maybe for now it carries on.
Let's talk about bias, because we can't have a conversation here about the BBC on the Nation of Taxpayers podcast and the Taxpayers Alliance without talking about possible or even perceived BBC bias. Who wants to go first? You go first, because I've certainly got a view, which again, and I'm plugging this a lot, it's in the BBC Watch blog, so go and check it out. But Rebecca, because you mentioned you get complaints from people in like Kashmir about perceived bias on the BBC World Service, do you think it's intentionally biased?
I think the BBC certainly has an agenda, and I think that it be based on that sort of London mindset. I don't think it's helpful to sort of talk about left or right wing bias. The BBC always comes back to that with sort of, well, if we're getting complaints from both sides, we must be doing it somewhere right. And I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it's a metropolitan elite bias. I think, and that's based on where the majority of the people that they employ, but also that sort of mindset, that London mindset of thinking they know better, they know. The rights and wrongs of what to say, and they view people outside the M25 as these kind of, rednecks who, are all sort of...
archaic dinosaurs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's the bias that comes through, and that's what people are really outside the M25 are really sort of sick of having these things preached to. And, things like, historic dramas are then having people who would not have been, they're not historically accurate and that kind of thing, that people are like, why is this happening? And that's what really frustrates people. We can't have historical accuracy, and they're being told that the countryside is racist. All of these things, all of the agenda is just seeped into.
Well, it's not helped, is it, by certain presenters? I mean, Chris Packham is always top of my list. He's a guy who's supposed to be banging on about beavers, and what's he doing instead? He's basically using the opportunity whenever I tune in to score political points and give his view, which it doesn't do the BBC any favours either. Because it's trying to pretend that it doesn't have any bias, and you have presenters like him popping up.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you've both said, and I think quite often what you see is just people on the BBC posturing so then they can then have a good story to tell at their next dinner that they're going to be hosting. And I think you can see some of that bias from when people leave the BBC. Where do they go? What do they do? And what do they say? And I think some of the big names we've heard recently that have left: Andrew Marr, Emily Maitlis, Lewis Goodall. I mean,
John Sopel.
I don't
Sheila
think
Fogarty left the BBC to go to LBC.
Exactly. I don't think that there is this massive, the BBC's too left-wing or too right-wing, but I do think some of the big on-air talent they have, when they do go off, they do reveal their political preferences in the channels they
isn't
work
it?
for.
Because I think I agree. I've sat in numerous news meetings, and I've never, and if I had witnessed it, I would have called it out or leaked it. I've never had a conversation with anyone which is like, we don't like the Conservatives, let's duff them up tonight. I've never seen that, but I think there's a certain kind of person that the BBC recruit, and not just London. There's a lot of news provision coming out of Salford in Greater Manchester. Manchester's a very progressive, left of centre city, so consequently you tend to employ people. You have people who have a certain set of values, and whilst I don't think they force it on stuff, I think there is almost this subconscious bias in how stories are reported or how they treat certain stories. And I remember, again, being in New Broadcasting House at one of the elections where Jeremy Corbyn was trying to be Prime Minister. And there was a young producer when the exit poll was revealed and it was clear that Jeremy Corbyn was not going to be Prime Minister. She burst into tears. And I would never say, and I've never witnessed her say, we must report this in a certain way. But that form of behaviour tells you everything you need to know, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Newsnight back in the Brexit days as well. I mean, it seemed to be every night there was a story about Brexit that was going on all the time. And again, I think that is an important issue. For example, for a lot of people in the country, it was at the time. But the idea that was the only thing that mattered to people throughout the country every single night is nonsense for a programme like Newsnight to be focusing on. I think people, as we say, outside of London, outside of Manchester, outside of the big cities, actually have a lot bigger things to worry about than a referendum vote that happened once. They're worrying about NHS provision. They're worrying about enough teachers for their schools. They're worrying about enough police on the streets and so on. But you don't hear those issues all the time. You hear about sometimes, as we say, some of the things that matter to people in metropolitan districts the most, rather than things that matter to the wider public the most.
We've only got a few minutes left of this podcast. Rebecca, it's been great having you in. Just a couple of thoughts then. If people want to support Defund the BBC, how can they do so?
Well, I think the biggest support that we would have is for people to go to defundbbc.uk and just see so that they know how they can stop paying the TV licence, because it's really, it's not clear on the BBC's website if any information out there. But the main thing is understanding, and if they want to be able to stop paying for the BBC, then do it. I mean, that's the most support we need. If they want to throw us a donation, they can. But the main thing for us is just to learn how you can go about not paying the BBC and cancel your TV licence.
Okay, and all of that information about how
Yeah.
you don't have to pay the licence fee is available on your website.
That's right.
Brilliant. All right, and the final question to both of you then. Let's have a little punt. So here we are in 2025. Do we think the BBC will be here in 2030 in its current form?
Yes, I think because of who the government is at the minute, and I think the fact that the BBC has been around so long, it's this monolithic creature which no one feels that anyone can touch or change. I think actually when the Charter Review comes around, I think despite all the evidence, I think the government will maintain the BBC in its current form with the current licence fee model.
So it's going to plod on, and in 5 years' time we'll be having this conversation again.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think the big question is, will it be around after the next Charter Review? So the one after this.
Yeah.
If it is, I'll be surprised then.
Yeah.
Okay, your thoughts, Rebecca?
No, I absolutely agree. I think 2030 is a difficult one because it would just be coming up for midterm review by the next government. And it could be that, you never know, we could have a reform government, couldn't we? I mean, we don't know. Everything in politics is completely up in the air at the moment. So we're in a brand new territory. But at that point, like you say, we would be midway through their charter. So yeah, I think it will probably still have it in 5 years' time, but hopefully not a couple of years after that.
I think if we had a reform government, they'd shut down New Broadcasting House and probably turn it into a pub. All right, listen, it's been a cracking conversation. Thank you, Rebecca. Lovely to meet you, and thank you for coming in. Darwin, great to have you on the podcast again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen, anything that you've heard as part of this particular podcast regarding the BBC you'd like to maybe pass comment on, do send us an email. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Also, if you want to support what we do with this podcast, please follow and subscribe. You find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify and YouTube as well. If you want to spread the word of what we do, please follow, share and subscribe. Thank you for listening.